Hey everybody, this is Grits. This is a response to ubergossen's video art question mark. I thought you hit on some pretty good points as far as the whole art thing. I liked the example of Ulysses as something that only someone that really understands literature can really get. I actually did try to pick up Ulysses. I'd heard that it was this great piece of literature. And I got through the first page and I put it down. I said, okay, that's it. I don't get that at all. I don't know. It's very stream of consciousness. It's very, I guess, I don't know if nonlinear is even the right word for it. I don't know exactly what it is, but very strange use of language, very strange use of like paragraph structure, sentence structure. And it just, I just knew right away. I was like, I'm not going to be able to get through this. Now, I hope to someday be able to read Ulysses. Maybe when I read enough books, maybe if I soften it up a little bit by reading some Faulkner and get into some more contemporary literature, I might eventually be able to pick it up and suddenly see this great work of art. And no doubt that will happen if I ever get to that point, but I'm shooting for 70 years old at this point. Anyway, I had a similar experience with music with Igor Stravinsky when I was in high school. I picked up The Rite of Spring by Igor Stravinsky, started listening to it, and kind of made myself listen to the whole thing. And all I remember from back then, oddly, is just a bunch of strange noises with no real defined rhythm and just kind of this mumbling nonsense that didn't sound like music at all to me. And so I put that away. I said, well, that's just overrated, you know. I had this idea that musicians just kind of say they like certain pieces of music just to impress people, to, you know, show how knowledgeable they are or something. However, after a few years at the university, I'd been listening to a little more progressive things. I'd gotten into some Shostakovich, got into some of Stravinsky's earlier works, and I decided to pick up The Rite of Spring again. And all of a sudden, it was like a new piece of music. It was just this brilliant, you know, emotional roller coaster, right? It's so colorful and dynamic, and it was just fantastic. And I couldn't believe I was listening to the same piece of music. So from this, I had kind of this revelation about music and art in general, that there was a language that you have to learn to really appreciate, I guess, music at what you would call a higher level or something. And I eventually got to appreciate a lot of contemporary music. I like the music of George Crumb. A lot of people will tell you, oh, George Crumb's not real music, it's just noise. But for some reason, there's something about George Crumb's music that appeals to me. So that was a good example with Ulysses, because I have a feeling that if I was a literature major, or say if I were a literature major, I would probably be able to appreciate that book. The only thing I noticed about your video that to me was almost like, I don't know if it's a mistake or it's just a tendency of people to try to put things in categories, but you started to try to define what good art was. And you use this criteria of how popular it is, which to me is just the most random and irrelevant factor. I mean, you might as well say, well, you know, what key it's in determines how great the music is. You use the example of Mozart, and you didn't accept this idea about, well, Mozart used to be popular back in his day. Well, okay, let's look at J.S. Bach then. J.S. Bach was not particularly popular in his day. Mozart was. And we're talking relatively, you know, obviously they didn't have the internet, you didn't have millions of people listening to it, but, you know, Bach wasn't particularly popular. The only effect of this seems to be that Bach's music was lost. A lot of it was lost because no one really thought it was a priority to keep track of all this stuff. And most of Mozart's catalog is intact. Bach and Mozart, if you were to talk to two different musicians, you might get two different assessments about who's the greater composer. Now, I might tell you that I like Bach's music more. I would say I prefer Bach's music, but a lot of other people would say they prefer Mozart. They're both considered to be two of the greatest composers of all time, and there's a reason for that. Their music is timeless. Anyway, the problem with this is that you have a composer that wasn't particularly popular, and then you have one that was. And then you've got both of them being very popular now, relatively speaking, as far as classical music is concerned. So what happened to this point? You know, judging music by how popular it is, you could use it as another example, something that's not very popular. Some rock bands, say. You might pick a relatively obscure band like the Decemberists, which to me is a great band. And then some other band that's still trying to hack away at bars that just isn't that good. And the reason they haven't made it is just that they just aren't that great. So you have the Decemberists who really haven't broken out into mainstream popularity because their music is kind of eclectic. You know, it's not your typical pop music. And then you have this other band which just basically sucks. So it doesn't really work on that level either. So I think the whole thing with people categorizing music, I never really understood it. Now, I'm sure I do it myself. I'm sure I do it in some abstract way I can't even understand or even perceive. But people like to say, well, this is great music because it's harmonically complex. Or this is great music because it was popular. This is great music because it's emotionally expressive. This is great because it has great counterpoint. And they'll say this is great because it has more chords and pop music has less chords, so pop music's not as good. And it's all arbitrary. If you really look at music, it's probably the most purely subjective art form there is. Music doesn't really serve a purpose, just concretely. I mean, some people might use it for therapy or something like that, but it doesn't really serve a concrete purpose. You were talking about firemen. Firemen serve a purpose. Music is just there to make people feel good or bad or frightened or whatever, but it doesn't really accomplish anything. It's just this abstract exploration of sound. So to say that there's somehow this boundary between what is good and bad music, it doesn't work. And to me, it limits what people can appreciate. Now, in some cases, if someone decides that, for instance, I kind of decided that classical music is the greatest form of music that ever existed. One of the reasons it's so influential, it lasted for such a long time. They got so complex with the harmonies. But that's still, just kind of my assessment of it, right? But because I appreciate it so much, I was able to delve into classical music more and get into the more esoteric and bizarre forms of classical music. And the same is true if someone really likes blues or jazz. If someone loves jazz, you can start with your Louis Armstrong, your more mainstream jazz, and then get into Miles Davis, and then get into more complex harmonies, and eventually have this taste for this really complex kind of jazz. For example, Bitches Brew by Miles Davis. A lot of people listen to Bitches Brew and they won't understand it. They say, that's not real jazz, that doesn't make sense. It makes me angry, or I don't like it. But I love that album. I listen to just enough jazz and contemporary music. When I heard that album, it just hit me, it just hit me so hard, and I just loved it. So the thing is if you're going to decide that a certain kind of music is superior, or a certain kind of art is superior, and you'll come to appreciate that genre of art, but you might miss out on something else. I'm probably a minority in this, but I'm a classically trained musician. I'm a clarinetist, and I happen to like Lady Gaga's music. You happen to bring it up. I kind of find her interesting. I don't really think Nickelback is particularly interesting, but Lady Gaga's whole kind of semi-satirical celebration of American excess and debauchery, to me, is kind of fascinating. And it's fascinating to me that it's accepted in the mainstream with such edgy lyrics. And this seems to get past people that seem to classify pop music as this thing that just doesn't have any kind of content or value whatsoever. And they tend to take all of the pop music and throw it all out as useless. And I think they're missing something. Setting up boundaries with music, it's like setting up fences in some abstract landscape that doesn't even exist, okay? There's great music everywhere, and if you cut yourself off, you might miss some of it. Anyway, that's just my opinion. Anyway, I think one of the reasons people start to think a certain kind of genre like jazz or classical is so great is that they'll have an experience like I had with Stravinsky's Rite of Spring or Bitches Brew, where they suddenly realize there's all this depth to this particular genre of music, And so they just want to say, this is the greatest. This is the greatest genre of music. This is real art. And they want to kind of cut everything else out because for some reason they don't think that that same depth exists anywhere else. And I think that's probably what happened to me with, like I said, with Stravinsky, where I thought, well, this is the greatest form of music there is, classical music, because there's just so much, there's so much diversity, there's just so much to explore here. But it is everywhere, and I think by limiting ourselves to what we consider art, we're just missing something. I may be missing something in some genre of music I haven't even touched on yet, and I like to think that if I listen to some strange new genre of music, I can still learn to appreciate it, learn the language of that kind of music.